just a point of interest. Some years ago, Catherine was at a conference in Africa, and she met this young African sister studying for her doctorate in theology, but with no access to a good library. And so Catherine arranged for her to come to Ottawa to have access to the library at St. Paul's University, and we had the privilege of hosting Sia while she was with us. Sister Barbara and I were living at another residence at the time, and we're thrilled to have Sia with us. And would you know, Sia was also a delegate for women of Africa at the Synod. So a marvelous connection. So we are delighted to have you with us, Catherine.
So thanks to all of you. I'm really happy to be with you today, and I'm going to share a little bit of my experience at the Synod. I want to thank also, I'm going to rely on Bob to change the slides, but I want to thank the women who put together the coffee for this morning and the group things, and I want to thank the line for their beginning with the fact that my computer was head of the door when I arrived here. So anyway, we've adapted. So this morning I want to share with you from the General Assembly of the Synod at Rome for the but I don't want to focus on the document, so talk about the process. And all about the process and learning. So where my focus will be. If you remember, the aim of the Synod, or Synod, is a 4-year process, and there will be a second in October. And this is, if you remember from the that the focus was on how it could become a more church. And I was asking, how did that happen? For the life in our in provincial and national contribution, and the church. How do the practices? How does the culture of our community that feel welcome? Wonderful example this morning of getting their journey. And real community of welcoming, supporting, sustaining these new practices. And as you'll hear from the Synod report design, perhaps this is a model for accompanying Christians at other moments in their journey in our communities. I also think it's important to start by also affirming that this is not a personal initiative or dream of Pope Francis alone, but in setting the agenda of the Synod, in the Synod every 3 years or so, is a body of representatives from around the world that was set up in 1965 by Pope Paul VI to express the collegial dimension of church governance and the bishop's collaboration with the Bishop of Rome in addressing questions that face the local community. And when they were consulted, they identified synodality as the top priority. Really, the consensus of such a world who wanted us and who acknowledged the need for us to focus on this. Mindful of the fact, no doubt, that since the Second Vatican Council, more than 2/3 of the ISCs in the world have not had faith. There are many countries around the world where there are no functioning pastoral councils. in these areas. Because the church left to the destruction of the church. It's required, and so one of the questions we're asking in our conversation is, does it have the law doesn't have a standard every 10 years. Or before that, it said every 3 years. It will happen. So what we're doing is trying to recover a very traditional practice in the life of the church. Next slide will show us. I'm sorry, the print is probably partially small in the room to see. Those of you who are at home, we've been through a long process since the fall of 2021, when Pope Francis initiated this process and asked bishops to consult their people at every level, in every community, all around the world. So all parishes were encouraged as much as possible to create spaces for listening, reflecting, and discerning. And it was also it's quite a stretch for many of us. We're still in the middle of a pandemic. So some of us met in long. Some people had online sessions. But the most important experiences were when we got together face to face and could with our pastors, our experience churches around the world. The results were diocese. Diocese had to produce and every diocese was made a report for the national constitution. 112 constitutions was reported to the Vatican. And theologians got together for several months to read and study every one of those reports and draft a synthesis. Was sent back to the churches where continental groups could look at it and say, is this a true reflection of experience and where we're feeling the call of God today to be and then all that kind of generated and what we call an instrumentum laboris, a working document. Sort of a big text was the jumping off point for our conversations when we gathered in Rome in October to kind of work through and reflect together again on what we were hearing in the lived experience of our churches, and also reading those experiences in light of the gospel and asking what needs to be renewed in our communities so that we are freer to respond to the call to mission today. How can we be those servants of the world who do exactly what this morning's gospel invited us to do, who feed the hungry, who clothe the naked, who visit those in prison? Where are those people in our communities? In a wealthy suburb like this, sometimes those people are hidden. We may not always see people living in material poverty, but they may be suffering from addictions, from broken relationships, from loneliness, from physical illness. So we're all invited to reflect on where is our community being called, and what needs to happen so we can be more responsive. So the next slide outlines who was at this meeting. It's quite historic that there were non-bishops who were full participants at the meeting, who had equal access to the microphone and full voting rights. So in all, there were 365 participants. And normally, there are a number of ex officio people, bishops, because of their office, who are invited as a matter of course, all the heads of the Eastern Catholic churches. Right away, there's 23 Eastern Catholic bishops. Ukrainian, Maronites, Melkites, Coptics, they were all present. Bishops who were also nominated by their peers in the conferences of bishops. So from Canada, we send typically 4 bishops from Canada, and there's always a balance of Francophone and Anglophone, and usually Eastern and Western Canada being represented in that delegation. The heads of all the offices of the Roman Curia were also present, many of whom are cardinals. Pope Francis is free also to invite who he chooses, and he invited another 52 people for their competencies. Some of them bishops, others priests, religious sisters, and laypersons. For this meeting also, Pope Francis asked the organization that represents religious orders around the world, the unions of superiors general of men's and women's religious communities, and each of them were to name five women and 5 religious men who would be present. And then this is where there's the most innovative aspect of this particular assembly. The Synod office invited every continental group, so from Oceania, Asia, Europe, Africa, the Middle East, North and South America, and from the Eastern Catholic churches. Each of those groups was invited to nominate 20 people from whom Pope Francis, with the help of the Synod office, would select 10 representatives. And these were priests, deacons, religious men and women, and lay people, laymen and women. So in North America, the Canadian Conference of Bishops nominated 10 persons. The United States Conference nominated 10. And in the end, the Synod office chose 4 persons from Canada, of which I am one, and 6 from the United States. So it's like winning a lottery. Also present, because Sister Jean mentioned this morning my ecumenical involvement, were fraternal delegates. This happens as a matter of course, and it's something we don't see very often, and we might take for granted. But for years, it's been the habit of the Synod office to invite representatives of other Christian world communions to be present at these meetings. And so there were about a dozen delegates who were invited from the World Methodist Council, from the Anglican Communion, from the Orthodox churches. There was a Romanian Orthodox delegate. And they took part completely in the conversations. They spoke and addressed the plenary assemblies like the rest, as each of us had the opportunity to do. And they did not have the right to vote, but I would say they participated fully, and they participated thoughtfully. And they're very engaged and concerned and encouraged by what they see happening in our church, because their own churches are facing the same tensions and challenges today. How do we live together in today's world as Christians? How do we govern our Christian communities in a way that helps us to hold together across tremendous cultural diversity? So their presence was very important, and I'll say more about that in a moment. There were some other invited guests, one of whom, for example, I can mention Frère Alois, who was the leader of the Taizé community, and a great theologian, Father Hervé Legrand, a Dominican, who's written in ecclesiology for years, and brought his wisdom and experience. And I was very privileged to be at the same table as he was, because I took part in both Francophone and Anglophone conversations. When we met in small groups, we were gathered together in linguistic groups. And then there were about over 50, over 60 women and men, predominantly religious women, who were present as facilitators or theological experts and advisors. So I'll share in the next slide, you'll see a little bit. I wanted to draw attention to the presence of women, which I know is important. We have the group of women here this morning with us from the St. Phoebe group. Read Romans chapter 16, verses 1 and 2 that are cut out of the lectionary. The feast of St. Phoebe, who's on the Roman martyrology, is on the 3rd of September, but she gets lost, and her feast day is lost because the feast of Pope Gregory VII, the Great, takes precedence. So there, I did my little PR for St. Phoebe, who was called a deacon of the church. So you can see at every table there were, 54 delegates. We had 35 working groups. That means that there were 1 or 2 women at every table. And many tables had women facilitators as well. So we were gathering at tables of 10. So we'll go to my next slide. This is a picture of what we call ourselves Team Canada, and we're threatening to take hockey sticks back with us next October and to have a game of street hockey in the piazza at St. Peter's someday. Present were Cardinal Gérard Lacroix, who's at the front on your right-hand side, the Cardinal Archbishop of Quebec, who is there because also, apart from being the primate of the Church in Canada, he's on the advisory group of cardinals that meets regularly with Pope Francis, and he's on the advisory council for the Synod office. Next to him is the new president of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, Bishop William McGrattan from Calgary, Alberta. And to his left, so I'm going up the side on the left, is Monseigneur Raymond Poisson, the past president of the Conference of Bishops, who's the Bishop of Saint-Jérôme in Quebec. And if you go a little higher on the left side towards the top, you'll see Bishop Marc Pelchat. He's the auxiliary bishop of Quebec, former dean of the Faculty of Theology at Laval University. And behind him, Archbishop Michael Miller, the Archbishop of Vancouver.
He was born in Ottawa and went to St. Joseph's High School,
okay,
and was a parishioner at St. George's Parish.
Right, he's a Sicilian. Yeah. So then you can see myself in need of a haircut there on the right side, and behind me is Sami Aoun, a layman, a member of the Maronite Catholic Church, a retired professor of political science at Université de Sherbrooke in Quebec. And next to him, Sœur Chantal Desmarais, a sister of charity of Sainte Marie, who lives north of Montreal, and who has a particular ministry to young people as a sensei, teaching karate. Next to her is Linda Stout, a laywoman recently retired as Director of Education for the Catholic School Board in London and Middlesex, Ontario. And she was involved, most of us were involved in some way, and most of those who are named to participate were involved in different ways in the synodal process locally. So Linda was very involved in her local diocese, but also helped to collate the results of the diocese from across Ontario and to produce the Ontario report. Behind Sami Aoun is Gilles Routier, professor of theology at Laval University, and he was among the advisors, the theological advisors, that were listening to what was emerging from all of our conversations and providing the raw materials for what would go into the report at the end of the process. Behind Jim is Father Jean Vézina, who lives here in Ottawa. He's the General Secretary of our Conference of Bishops. So why enlarge the participants in the Synod beyond the participation of bishops? Critics and people who have a lot of fears and misgivings about this whole process. And some of those fears were voiced in the Synod Hall, but I would say by a small minority of voices. people are asking, how can this be a synod of bishops? It's bishops who make decisions, and why are all these lay people here, and why are they voting? This can't be a synod like another synod. We have to clarify the status of the synod, or the synodal assembly. I think that's an unfortunate, these questions were also raised near the end of the process after we had been walking together and working together for several weeks. And there were bishops who were uneasy going into the process, but who began to relax when we got to know each other and when they saw how the process worked, and were very, very happy, and as I'll show you in a moment, would not be inclined to go back to the way things were before this experience. So why include other baptized Christians together with the synod, the bishops in this meeting? Well, first of all, because the bishops are not formally exercising their pastoral teaching office. This is not a deliberative vote, it's a consultative process. It's a consultative process. And the Synod of Bishops, as it has functioned until now, has been largely a body that is an instrument of the papacy. Pope Francis is reversing the dynamic a little bit and wants to make it a space where he says the voices of the local churches can be expressed. And the synodal report, the synthesis report, says that those of us who are not bishops were there, lay people, religious priests and deacons, as witnesses of a process that intends to involve the whole church and everyone in the church. Why should bishops listen to the baptized? Well, how can they be their pastors if they don't? That's the simplest question. But I do recall months ago, one of the most critical voices in this process is Cardinal Gerhard Müller, a retired Cardinal Archbishop who was, for a brief time, the head of the dicastery or the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, says, "We don't need all these meetings. We are bishops. We make the decisions." But in a sense, this is denying the wisdom that exists in the living faith of the whole people of God. And Pope Francis is inviting us, and inviting the bishops in a more intentional way, to be listening and attentive and discerning together with all the baptized who have received the gift of the Holy Spirit, the same Spirit that's guiding the whole church. The bishops don't have a special access to the understanding and knowledge of the gospel. They have to work hard like the rest of us to understand it. And they need to listen to the living faith of the community to know what are the issues and the challenges that are confronting us. Where are the dissonances? Where do we need to do a better job? Where do we need to grow in understanding the gospel? So this comes from the dignity that we share as baptized Christians and our dignity as a people, the priestly, holy people of God. So the next slide, I think we skipped one, Bob. No, I guess not, sorry. My presentation is a little different from yours, okay? Okay, so this, I wanted to underline that this is a teaching of the Second Vatican Council, which is also an effort to recover some important insights, a more biblical ecclesiology, a more biblical self-understanding of the church, and that focuses on the church as both a mystery of communion, that underlines our participation in the divine life of the Trinity through baptism and the dignity of the whole people of God. The council or the Synod Assembly itself has understood itself and says in its synthesis report that this synodal path is in fact implementing what the Second Vatican Council taught concerning the church as a mystery and a people of God called to holiness. And it wants to reaffirm that the assembly, the Synodal Assembly, values the contribution of all the baptized made according to their respective vocations in helping us to better understand the gospel. In this sense, the Synod, the Synod process, constitutes a true act of further reception of the Council, prolonging its inspiration and reinvigorating its prophetic force for today's world. So, Pope Francis has said a couple times, it takes about a century to receive the insights of an ecumenical council, and we're just about halfway into that process. And there are elements of the teaching of the Second Vatican Council that we haven't fully received or understood or applied or put into practice. And so this is what we're trying to recover, the dignity of all the baptized. And I would say, I like this expression, we're reinvigorating its prophetic force for the world. I think I heard, and many of us felt, that prophetic force in what was shared in the conversations that took place in this assembly. Okay, so this slide I borrowed from the website of Synod, but it's a kind of effort to show the many activities of the participants in the Synodal Assembly over the whole month of October. You can see we began by meeting in a prayer vigil on the 30th of September, an ecumenical prayer vigil, about which I'll say more in a moment, that was really important and set the tone. And as soon as this was an evening prayer service, and this was an idea and an inspiration from the Brothers of Taizé, who work with many young people, also to have them participate and contribute. And I think it was one of those moments. I remember sitting through the prayer, and many of us were deeply moved by this experience. And we began to feel the weight of what was ahead of us. And we left St. Peter's Square from that prayer service, and we got on a bunch of buses, 350 people, and we left town and went out to a retreat center 30 kilometers outside the city of Rome, where we prayed together and met together over a period of 3 days. We began to get to know each other. We were sharing meals together, and we began to hear the messages that were provided to us by Timothy Radcliffe, the retired Master General of the Dominicans, that really helped us set a tone for what we were going to do. And he and a Benedictine Sister Mother Angelina, who gave biblical reflections also, they would continue to accompany us through the whole synodal process. And the process is broken down into stages or modules. And you can see this follows the structure of the working document, the Instrumentum Laboris. So we'd spend the first period of 4 or 5 days focusing on the first introduction to the working document. And then the next 4 days looking at part B, module 1, module 2, module 3. There's a whole set of questions under each of those sections of the working document. And we worked through it very systematically. But at the beginning of each stage, we had a liturgy together in St. Peter's Basilica, celebrated by different linguistic and cultural groups. We had a Byzantine liturgy led by the Eastern Patriarchs. We would hear again from Timothy and Sister Mother Angelina. We would hear from some of the participants in the Synod who gave witness to their experience of the themes that we were considering. And again, it set the tone for us to come back and begin working in small groups and address the questions that we were studying together. So we would work on these questions in small groups. We would pull together from our reflections a summary report of 2 pages from each of the 35 groups that would then be shared in a plenary session. And we listened to 35 reports from 35 groups, and then individual speakers could also address the plenary. It was all quite a remarkable process. After we had heard all this, we would go back and say, do we want to re-examine what's in our report from our group? Does it need to be adjusted because of what we've heard? So that's kind of how the process went. There are also important moments of prayer. I mentioned the liturgies that began each new stage, but there was a time of, we had moments of fasting and prayer for peace because of the war in the Middle East and in many other places where bishops had come from Sudan, from Myanmar, from Ukraine. We had an evening prayer celebration in St. Peter's Square for refugees. And we made a pilgrimage to the catacombs also to remember the pact of the catacombs made by a group of the bishops who were at the Second Vatican Council, who made a commitment to live a more simple lifestyle and to help their churches live in greater solidarity with the poor. So I want to come back and just say how important this ecumenical prayer vigil was. These photographs show the heads of virtually all the major Christian communities in the world today, the Christian communions. You see Patriarch Bartholomew, the Patriarch of the Orthodox Churches, next to Francis, and on his other side is Justin Welby, the head of the Anglican Communion, but the heads of all of the Orthodox, Armenian, Coptic, Syrian Orthodox churches, the head of Lutheran, Reformed, Baptist, World Communions. I sat next to, for one of these modules for almost a week, I sat next to the fraternal delegate, who was a young woman theologian from the Baptist World Alliance. She said that photograph has done more for ecumenical relationships than 40 years of ecumenical dialogue. So it was a really important witness of our church leaders praying together, witnessing to our faith together, and that's really the objective of our whole search for Christian unity as well. You see, what you don't see in these images is the presence of young people who had actually made a pilgrimage across the city of Rome that day, carrying the icon of Santa Maria del Popolo, a favorite icon of Mary of the people, of the people of Rome, that would be in the Synod Hall with us for the next month. So I thought it's important just to reflect a little on what a radical shift in style this is. And this is the point of the whole process. So on your left, you can see the bishops meeting at a previous synod in the Synod Hall. It's in the same building. But normally that's how the bishops would meet. And they would all wear their soutanes every day, and they would be sitting theater style. And in the front row are the cardinals, and the bishops are seated in order of precedence or seniority. So the elder bishops sit up close to the front, and the younger bishops are seated back in the back rows. And they would also follow this order of precedence when they wanted to get to the microphone. Wow. So, and then this is the way we sat for the whole month, the image on the right. We sat at round tables where no bishop governed the conversation or dominated. There was a facilitator at every table who was not a bishop. And we sat, you can see men and women, you can see most of the bishops lost their soutanes and were happy to come in working dress. We came in every day, we had a name tag with a QR code, and at each of our places, we had a designated place, there was a tablet, we had to scan in to register our presence, and then we would have access in the tablet to the agenda for the day and the documents that we would be discussing. Or if we were in a plenary discussion, we could send our request to get in the queue to address the assembly. And so it was a pretty sophisticated technological setup, because also at each table, you'll see in a moment, but in the center of each table are 4 computer screens where we could always see the speaker, whoever was speaking. And there was a camera in the center that if it was my turn to speak, the camera would turn around and focus on me, and everybody in the hall would have my image on their screen and my name on the bottom and the country I came from. So it was a very, very impressive setup, and it worked very well for most of the time. I'm sure they had lots of technical headaches, just like we did this morning. So the way we proceeded was, and here you see also Pope Francis would come to most of the general congregations or the plenary sessions. So he wasn't there the days we were working in small groups, but when the reports were shared in the plenary assembly, he was there. And he sat at the table. There was really a table of the presiders from the Synod office. But there were also a series of rotating presidents of the proceedings for each day. And they included patriarchs and bishops and women, religious and lay women, who took turns as kind of the speaker or the president of the assembly for the day. And you can see in the bottom photo here, you can see one of the women. This is Sheila Pires from Mozambique. And as she's speaking, she would be at a Portuguese speaking table. All of this is going on in 5 languages: English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian. And so when we spoke in the plenary assembly, there was simultaneous translation in each of the 5 languages. So she's speaking, but you see her image on the computer screen in front also. So when we would have a theme or a set of questions, and we began our work in our small group, we began always with prayer. Each day began with morning prayer, but in each individual table, we also began with a moment. The day begins also with an invocation of the Holy Spirit, a prayer that some of you have been using as you prayed for us also through this process. And then each person was invited to speak and share what they wanted to share in relation to our agenda, our questions that were to invite. Now, each of us had 3 minutes. And sometimes the topics we were discussing are very complex. You know, I was in a group that was talking about the relationship between the ordained priesthood and other baptismal ministries. A huge, complicated question for me as a theologian. So it's kind of a professional thing. But you know, we wanted to hear, how is this lived out in the life of the churches and represented around the table? I could be sitting at a table with the patriarch of the Maronite churches, 3 or 4 bishops from Africa, from Mali, Sudan, from Niger, so depending on the linguistic group. When I was in an English-speaking group, I was at a table with bishops from the Philippines, from Nigeria, from the United States, and other Eastern Catholic bishops. So it was a very diverse thing. And listening, you get to hear the diversity and both the richness, but my goodness, what different worlds we live in the experience of churches around the world. With those 3 minutes, I wanted just to say, if you really had something to say, you wanted to work hard and be prepared. So I would bring a text. I had 3 minutes to speak. I may not even read my whole text, but I would read the most important part of my text. And every participant was free to submit their written text to the Synod office, who was gathering all of this data. After these 3 minutes, we would hear from everyone. We would take time to pray and ask, what have we heard? Where have I been touched? And not at the level of feeling and emotion, but to ask, where am I hearing God's Spirit at work? Where am I hearing the resistances to the Spirit? Where can we identify convergences and also points of tension and divergence? And so the report from each table was to be a reflection of what was emerging, both convergences, divergences, points of tension, and points that need further deepening, more theological reflection. So that was what was in our reports from each of the tables. And so after this process of reflecting in our small groups, sharing in the plenary, then reflecting back on what we heard in the plenary, we would submit a report, 2 pages from each of the 35 tables on 15 different questions, and then we'd move on to the next stage. So through this process, we produced or gave birth to 2 texts. The first one, I think, will be, we hope, would be of interest to most of you, the Letter to the People of God that was published on the 25th of October. And it was the leaders of the Synod office, and there was a commission also. We nominated 7 representatives from each of our continental groups to participate in a commission for the drafting of the synthesis report that came out of the assembly. And Cardinal Lacroix was our delegate to that commission. But they felt that, the report we were producing is a pretty big and complex and complicated thing. And not a lot of people might read it or study it or understand it. It's because it's a very complex text, and it's a work in progress. But we wanted to speak directly to the members of our churches, and that's what this letter intends to do. And it wants to remind you that those of us who are at the Synod have been deeply aware and praying for all of you in the local churches, but we're especially mindful of Christians who are living today in contexts of war and violence, in great poverty and instability, those who are confronted with or who are in the process of migrating. We think of all the refugees around the world. These situations are not going to get better. And as we move further also into the ecological and climate crises that we're facing. So we're deeply mindful of the world context. We're deeply mindful of the people in our communities. We want to say that synodality is not just an idea or an ideology, but it's something we're trying to live. And this whole process, in my experience, is like a big laboratory. The goal is not to produce a report. The goal was to enable the bishops to learn this kind of conversation and this process of communal learning and decision-making. Some of the bishops and clergy who belong to religious orders will have more experience with this kind of process of discernment and decision-making. But many diocesan bishops have no experience of anything like this. And they were very nervous at the beginning. And some of and there's a few ghost têtes in the room, who would say, like, why aren't we talking about theology? We need to be debating these ideas in theology. And we're saying, be patient. We need to listen. This is about listening to understand what people are really, really living. Theology should reflect on that lived experience. It doesn't come first. They come from a world of ideas and concepts, and they try to then impose it, their abstract ideas, and when it doesn't fit, they're kind of lost. And that's part of our experience of church, I would say, in the last 30 or 40 years. We've had lovely theologies that don't fit our lived experience. And in my experience, the walls are falling down. We're seeing it doesn't fit anymore. And so we need to take seriously the lived reality. And there's a huge job for us as theologians to reflect on that reality. So Francis, I don't know if you're aware, he published a letter to the Academy of Theology in the Vatican 2 or 3 weeks ago about how theology today needs to be contextual and more inductive and take seriously the practical, concrete, lived experience of people in the world today. So the Synod itself wants to do this. Most of the bishops who come away from this experience would say, boy, I'm not sure I want to go back to the Synod hall again. And I'm not sure I want to go to a meeting again where there's no women or lay people or representatives from our churches. So the commitment in the letter to the people of God is, it says here, to progress in its discernment, the church absolutely needs to listen to everyone, starting with the poorest. So there's an acknowledgement also, we need to work harder to really hear the voices of people on the margins. And that we've acknowledged this still requires a process, a path of conversion. We're not there yet. We're setting out on the way, but we have a lot to learn yet. So the final synthesis report is a thick document. It's 40 pages. It has 350 paragraphs, and we voted on every paragraph individually. And they were all hammered out. We were presented with a draft in the final week, and we went back to our small groups, and we were invited to propose amendments. Well, we proposed there were over 1,000 proposed amendments. So the drafters did a huge rewrite in a period of a day and a half. I don't think they went to bed. And came out with a report that we think is a fair reflection of the many, many, many things that were on this agenda. I think if you look at it, in a moment we'll change and we'll look at the 3 sections of the many topics we talked about. It's divided into 20 sections. There are 81 recommendations in this report. If we took them seriously and if they were implemented, we would have a complete renewal of our structures and practices in the life of the church. The most urgent the only one of these recommendations that is called urgent is for the participation and recognition of the contributions of women at every level in the life of the church today. So I want you to know that you've been heard. So the report's in 3 parts. These are my last slides. And I'm just showing you the table of contents from the 3 parts of the final report. The first part is a reflection on our experience of synodality and an effort to give a bit of a theological framework to it. We acknowledge that the idea of synodality is really new and really foreign and seems really abstract to a lot of people, and we need to clarify it. And people are asking for us to give a deeper theological grounding for it. That's fair. That's fair. We've got a couple dozen theological experts who are with us in the Synod, and we're going to ask them to do some of that work for us. There's also, if you see here, the place of those who live in poverty, who are protagonists of their own liberation in the churches and participants in the church's journey. So we want to take seriously the poor and the marginalized and let them, in a sense, set the agenda. We need to hear their experience. And to acknowledge that the church what we lived and experienced is just this tremendous diversity of people from different cultures and worldviews. And this is what makes the Catholicity of the Church, but it's also where we experience many points of tension and difficulty and a challenge to understand each other within the Church. So Eastern churches have raised a very important question to all of us today, because in most contexts, if you think the roots of the Eastern Catholic churches are in the Middle East, in North Africa, where because of violence and conflict and all kinds of pressures, the majority of their people now live elsewhere. I was in a residence with Patriarch Seko, the head of the Chaldean Catholic Church. 90% of Catholics from Iraq have left in the last 20 years. So they're living in Detroit. Yeah, Dearborn, Michigan. Or the biggest community of Melkites in the world lives in Brazil today. So the structures and practices we have concerning the jurisdiction that these bishops have over the life of members of these churches in other territories, they're asking us to revisit those. So, the question of ecumenism was, my Baptist friend said to me, wow, like there's no resistance to the ecumenical question. The Synod says we're at a kairos in the ecumenical movement. We know we need to move forward to unity together, and our people are desirous of this. The question of sacramental sharing, especially for people in interfaith families, is pretty wide open. Could we be more generous? So part 2 focuses more on mission. Even the word mission is a delicate term to use. If you're a Christian living in Mali today, or living in the Middle East, or living in Asia, or living in India, in Hindu nationalist India. It was very interesting having conversation about this. There's the issue of women, very high in the priority, and the question of women's ordained ministries, especially the ordination of women to diaconal ministries, is a very live question. So one of the major American journals had a headline after the Synod that said, the Synod didn't decide in favor of ordaining women to the diaconate. That's not the story. More than 80% of the Synod participants voted to keep this alive on the agenda. So it's not the job of the Synod to make that decision, but it's a live question. Not everybody's on the same page, but more than 80% of the people are behind it. And if you took out all the non-bishops voting on this question, there'd still be 70% of the bishops in favor. So I think there's a lot of movement on these questions. There's reflections here on lay movements and religious orders, deacons, priests, bishops. There's a desire, and this is a response to the sexual abuse crisis, of course, for much more transparency and accountability in church leadership and church governance. There's a recommendation that bishops undergo an annual performance review. And that there be regular evaluations for priests and deacons, and that we rethink our whole approach to formation, to seminary education, but also to all Christian formation, so that formation doesn't end. All of our catechesis, we've done a wonderful job since Vatican II of liturgically based catechesis, but we have very little to offer people after confirmation class. And to be Christian in today's world, we understand people want to continue being informed about their faith, to learn how to understand the Bible, how to pray with the Bible, how to practice other forms of Christian prayer, how to understand Catholic social teaching and what it means for our living in society and in different cultures today. So The final slide I have is on the third part here. There's that question of formation. It's very high on the agenda. It was like a refrain that came up almost every time we had a plenary session. There's a whole set of open questions that are laid out. One of the new items there is the question of the digital environment and acknowledgement of the world of young people today, and a recognition that the digital world needs evangelization. There are too many people parading around as Catholics and Christians on the internet with really terrible, terrible approaches and presentations of the Christian faith, very distorted presentations of our tradition. And so there's a desire for us all to be, I think, more, how do we say, digitally friendly, better able to communicate who we are and what our faith tradition is in this milieu, and to see it as a way of reaching out, especially to young people. And then there's questions here about all these structures for participation, and this begins from your parish pastoral council to the diocese to the National Conference of Churches, and how all of these structures and practices could be more inclusive and more participatory and more, I would say, stable and permanent. So that we're asking, does a diocesan pastoral council, should this not be a required structure? And should it not be required to meet regularly and to include a certain representation? To ask, how are people chosen for parish council? How does the parish council have a way of listening to others more widely in the parish and in the community around us? So there you have it. It's a pretty ambitious agenda that we undertook. I hope you can find some encouragement in the fact that the Synod is working very, very hard. It's confronting with a whole lot of very, very complex questions. Maybe I could close just by saying that 10 years ago, Pope Francis wrote his first apostolic exhortation, which was a follow-up to a synod, the Synod on the New Evangelization. And his letter on the joy of the gospel set out what he said was a programmatic, was the program for his episcopate. And again, this is not a personal program, but it's what he heard were the concerns of other bishops. And in that letter, he called for a pastoral and missionary conversion of the whole church. And he invited us to begin re-examining all the structures and practices in the life of the church today to ask, do they serve the mission of the church? Do they enable us to communicate the love of God in the world where we live today? And I think we're doing it. I think the synodal process is the pathway that has been chosen to help us to do that. And it's a very remarkable thing to behold. So I feel very graced to be part of it.
Bob Cherney is going to come and be the facilitator for the Q&A. And after that, we have some marvelous, delicious looking soup there. So we hope that you'll stay and have conversation at the table and continue this. Okay? So,
thank you, Sister Jean. I will stay here for one reason. I still need to control as best I can what's happening for our guests online. I'll recognize people and ask you to keep I thought I would be picking it up. Okay.
No, you don't have to actually. That's connected to that. It's okay.
Nope.
Reverse what you did.
You have to turn the sound off your computer.
I just did.
Yeah.
Okay. So what? Okay. So I'll recognize you. If you maybe if you offer a very long question, I'll cut you off, all right? Because I think we need to be fair to everybody. The people online will not be able to speak, but I'll see their written questions. Okay, people online, and I'll read them out to you. Okay, the first one I've seen is John Williams. Please stand up.
Could you say briefly what the next steps are, and especially how the first session relates to the next session next year?
I wish I could. We're waiting to get our marching orders, if I can say. Certainly, if you read the final lines of the synthesis report, it says that our hope is that all of the national conferences of bishops will be engaged in the process of receiving and reflecting on this report, and will be invited to give some of that feedback to the Synod office. That feedback will form the basis for a working text that we should receive sometime in the summer, and that we will use as a preparation for the assembly next fall. So, and we don't even have the dates yet. We expect it will be in the month of October next year. So I would say stay tuned. We're meeting, our delegation is meeting online next Monday, and in a couple weeks' time, we will be speaking with the bishops across Canada about our experience. And perhaps at that point, Cardinal Lacroix and others will have some more insight about a little more precisely what's being asked of us. So we're all, I think, in the process at every stage, the Synod office has produced material and then gone back to the local churches to say, how does this fit? Does this resonate with your concerns and your experiences? Or we might ask, I mean, goodness, 81 recommendations, 20 different sections and issues. Perhaps the next stage might choose to prioritize some. I don't know. I don't know what the process will be. There are issues around the inclusion and participation of women in ministry, a number of issues related to human sexuality that are real points of tension. We are no different than any other world Christian communion in facing these questions. There's a tremendous diversity of perspectives depending on the cultures we come from. And so there might be some thought given to, are there processes, different kinds of processes that might help us to face these divergences or to create greater consensus? I don't know. But I mean, there's a whole host of issues on which a lot of things could be carried forward very quickly because there's not opposition. So, and the other thing is, one of the recommendations, and one of the most important recommendations, is that we begin a complete review and updating of the Code of Canon Law, so that we can say, you know, I mentioned the example of your parish pastoral council. Is this a required structure? Is there a requirement about how often they need to meet? Is there a requirement about how participants are chosen? The same could be said at the diocesan level. How often could there be a diocesan synod? Who participates in a diocesan synod? How frequently should they meet? Those are all things that could be revisited very quickly. It would take, well, when I say quickly, in the life of the Catholic Church, we're asking to do things, we're asking to move 1.4 billion people. So no mean feat, but it would take a few years to review and revise the Code of Canon Law, but there's a recognition that this needs to happen.
Thank you.
Marilyn Olson, I just have a little question about the logistics, and you might have said it, I'm sorry if I missed it, about your seating at those tables.
Yes.
It changed from day to day, week to week, and how intentional was it? Somebody was looking at a list and said, for Professor Clifford will be at this table with these people, or how did that all kind of?
So before we went to Rome, we were invited to, if you go back and look at the working document, the Instrumentum Laboris, in Part B, that's where the nuts and bolts are. There were 3 sections, A, B, and C, and there were 5 questions under each of those 3 sections. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we were invited to indicate our preference for the questions we wanted to work on. And it was not possible in every case to get your first choice. So we indicated our first and second choices, and then we also indicated our preference of linguistic groups. So they did their best to put us in areas, you know, and I think I tried to choose, not in terms of, not because I have an agenda, but where is it that I have something to contribute constructively to a conversation? So that's why I ended up in a group on ministries and where there's a lot of ecclesiological issues, which is my bailiwick. So that's how they were done. And we would work in these small groups for about 4 days. So there would be a plenary session to begin, and then we would work in an afternoon and a morning, working in small groups to produce a first draft of our small report. And the afternoon of the second day, we would start sharing those reports in the plenary session. That would go on for a day and a half, and then we would come back in our small group and look at our draft report again and hash out the final version of it. And we would all vote at each table on that text. And the process was constructive enough that in most cases, the votes were unanimous in favor of our reports, where we identify our points of convergence. There's also space there to say, here's where we diverge. So that the report was a fair reflection of the conversation at our table. So then we would, after 4 or 5 days, we would move to another table and move to a next working group and question. So we worked long hours. We worked Saturday until all Saturday morning. We worked 6.5 days a week.
Thank you. Mary Ann?
And then Sister.
Thank you, Catherine. I found it very interesting that you had said that theology must reflect the lived experience of the people of God. And I just wonder if you personally, having gone through this process, have changed your ideas of which areas are the most important that must be reflected in that.
Could you repeat the question to all of us?
So the question is, given my experience of the Synodal process, can I just ask, did my views change on the questions that theology?
You didn't have an agenda when you went in, and I'm just wondering if you had hopes or expectations and how those might have changed. That it's a question of someone who is.
Yeah, so have my hopes or expectations changed, and did I go in with an agenda? So I would say, no, I tried very hard not to go in with an agenda. I think that's very counterproductive, and that doesn't respect the kind of process this is. I have a lifetime of experience. Somebody said to me, what did you do to prepare? You know, of course, I kept looking at the Instrumentum Laboris. I thought, my God, it's so huge. No, how could we possibly do all this? But I said, no, look, I've been teaching for 35 years and studying the church and its structures and practices. I wrote a doctoral dissertation on the conversion of the church. And I lived to see a pope who invites us to do the work of helping the church to be renewed and converted. And then I get invited to the table. That's pretty humbling. I think that my experience of participating in the Synod has helped me appreciate even more the complexity of the global Catholic community and the challenge of finding there is no one-size-fits-all answers to many of these questions. But I think we can all agree that around the world, lay people have said, we're so happy to be heard and listened to and taken seriously. So that's one. Around the world, women in all different contexts said, we feel like marginalized people in our own church where we happen to be the majority of people in the pews. So that's beginning to be heard. It's beginning to be heard. And we know that women are already doing and have done for many, many years important forms of pastoral ministry that need to be better remunerated, better acknowledged, better integrated as stable ministries in the structure of a local church. So I'm not less convinced about any of those things. I am more convinced of the need for better theological work and better communication on those questions and a better understanding of our own tradition that had women who were in ordained ministries. That's where the question of women deacons is so important. Until the Middle Ages, when they were really unceremoniously chased out of the sanctuary for some pretty misogynistic reasons. So I think what women are asking for is just a recognition of the fact of what they are already contributing, not to upend the whole tradition of the church, and that this style of leadership also that makes some leaders very uncomfortable is not to weaken the ministry of the ordained priesthood or of bishops, but actually to enhance it. That we will have more credible leaders if they learn to listen and act together and to welcome the gifts and competencies of people in our communities. And it's a hard thing to learn, it's a hard culture. We're undoing the cultures and practices of the last millennium. So it's taken us a long time to get here. It won't be undone easily.
There's quite a few more questions, so with Sister Barbara, and then Peter over there, and then Maria.
I'm really glad you were there. And I know that the students that you will be with in the future are probably going to benefit from that. One question I had when you were going through it, it was number 5 on the first part, when you were summarizing, and it was the participation, and it mentioned tribes. And I was wondering, were there a number of indigenous people from throughout the world, not just in Canada and the United States, but throughout those other countries? I know they may have had people involved in church that would have been there, but were there indigenous people present?
So the question is, were there indigenous participants in the synodal process, in the synodal assembly? Not as an identified group. The theme that you mentioned was section 5, a church out of every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. I know that the Canadian bishops and the Australian bishops in particular are very seized by the questions of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and the need to confront our history of mission. And I think we need to work harder so that that's more in the awareness of bishops in other contexts. Also in Latin America, there were bishops who had been at the Synod for the Amazon region who were also present. And they're very, very mindful of the need to adapt to the presence of the church among Indigenous peoples in the Amazon region. So it's one of many issues, but I would say no, it wasn't raised up as a big priority. I do think it kind of hangs over the Synod in the way that we're thinking differently about mission today, and thinking more about processes of enculturation and dialogue with peoples in local cultures. One place that there's still a lot of, I think, a huge blind spot to that, in my experience, is in some parts of Africa. we still have a very colonial church in some parts of Africa. And it's not top of mind yet.
Peter.
Peter?
Yes, Pete Mulder here, Kathy. I'm just wondering, Kathy, do we have buy-in from our bishops right here in the Archdiocese? The reason I ask that is because when I go on the website of various parishes in Ottawa, and I look up what's going on with the Synodal Process, I see nothing has been done at quite a few of the parishes. So that leads me to the question of being, well, okay, do we have buy-in from our own bishops?
Yeah.
So that's my question.
Oh, I want to assure you that the delegation that was present at the Synod are completely on board and very committed to this, very committed to carrying this forward in the local churches. And I think the leadership that Cardinal Lacroix has given is quite remarkable. Already in the province of Quebec last March, at the Assembly of Bishops there, all the bishops from all the dioceses in Quebec are beginning to look together with pastoral leaders, lay and ordained, about how this will transform the life of every parish and diocese across the province. So we also need to get moving in that direction. I would also say the North American process was at the continental stage. There wasn't a strong presence even on the website of the CCCB. Because this was kind of taken over by the U.S. Conference of Bishops. And I hope that our Conference of Bishops will step up a little more going forward. And I think that under Bishop McGrattan's leadership, that's likely to happen. I know this is a moment of rethinking the structures of the Conference of Bishops, and that restructuring will be deeply influenced by the process that we're undergoing right now. I think it's fair to say that the whole process has been spotty everywhere. You know, there's always some parishes who do it better, some dioceses that do it better, some dioceses that don't have the means to do it, some bishops who are not on board and not taking the initiative. But that's just a fact of the churches around the world. Still, this is coming. So this is not a one-off. This is the path forward, and so I think we have to work if we have church leaders and pastors and members of the clergy who are not on board. We have to work harder with them, help them understand the importance and the necessity of this. And I would say one of the groups we're very concerned about is young, recently ordained priests, who, in a sense, we've done a great disservice by not giving them the type of formation and the skill set in leadership that they need to be the presider over a community today. So those conversations are happening, and to me that's encouraging. But it will be a lot of work,
Maria?
I'm a teacher with Catholic School Board, so I'm just thinking, like, when we have things like this, the people that are here right now are people that actively, search and they want the answers. Is there a way that you think we can almost, for lack of a better word, force, like our teachers, our, people at the Catholic School Board, maybe even just to listen to this, like this recording, this hour, where they really get to know the Synod and, the way you've laid it out. I'm wondering if you've ever thought of a way that we could almost make it mandatory for some of our teachers, some of our heads to listen to this.
It should be part of your professional development. I have spoken to the Association of Supervisory Officers of Ontario. I know Linda Stout, who's a former director of education, is also working with, I think, directors across the province. I did a workshop earlier last year. I can't remember anymore. I've done a few. With the the chaplains in the Ottawa secondary schools. So there are groups who are plugged in and who are interested, but I think we need to do more to get the message out, and maybe in your own networks you can put this on the agenda for any professional development events that your association has in the next year or two.
Father Darrell, do you have a question?
I don't have a question. I know we want to eat, so is there anyone that has a burning desire to ask a question right now? Otherwise, I think the biggest challenge I'm seeing, like in my diocese, where I'm just one priest among many, is a deep resistance to these kinds of conversations. There's almost a fear. I don't know what it is, but when we begin to talk about something like women's ordination, it becomes angry and resistant to the notion. That's here in this diocese. And also, but it's the same thing with reconciliation. So many things that can be discouraging. So one of the things how I try to keep myself from becoming discouraged is we have many different spiritualities in the church, like you witnessed this, and there's room for everybody. And if we can keep that, then that's how I manage my own, from not allowing myself to become too depressed about the situation. So I know that I have a spirituality heavily influenced by so many factors of growing up, and so I don't, and what I think is there's room for me too, in the way I think, because I don't just exist alone, I exist in communities, several. So that's what I'm thinking. So I do, we live in such a polarized state in North America, so much polarity, where I've heard as many as 50% of the bishops in the United States are opposed to Pope Francis, and the laity too. So what's being done can seem, as you mentioned, quite overwhelming, but I still feel that this is God's Spirit working in our church, and I feel that Francis is a real gift to us at this moment in our history. Like, I don't know where we would be without Francis right now, who is encouraging and inspiring all of these hopeful attitudes about the future of our parish.
Thank you for the observation. I think that we now have a little thank you.
I just want to make a comment, and then I'll hand it to Kathy. I just want to say that we had a marvelous synod process in our parish. Brother Darrell led us in that. We explained what we wanted to have happen, and he said, listening is what's important. And we had over 20 groups, and we have a marvelous report that's on our website, and the three writers of the summary document are here, the three J's. John, Jennifer, and Jean. Just a little bit of self-promotion. No, but if you read the report from the parish and then compare it, I haven't read the new one yet, but I think you'll find through there. And now I hand off to Kathy, and please join 5 marvelous, I think 5 soups, 6 pots of soup. Here, Kathy. So please join.
Oh, okay, I should use this.
Yes,
Okay. I just want to say thank you so much, Catherine, for taking the time to come here. And I think this was an absolutely wonderful presentation, because not only have we gotten more clarity about what went on at the Synod, but I think what you communicated to us was the spirit of what was happening there. And I think although we're going to carry on, as Jean said, the synodal process, I think we understand better now, thanks to you, really where we're going with this, what it all means. I know when it started, I really had no idea, what it really meant. Knew the word, but, what did it mean in practice, and how are we going to participate? And then when we did, we had this wonderful turnout. And a lot of people who started on this journey felt at first reluctant. I'm looking here at my colleague who said, I don't know why I'm sitting here, but somebody forced me to come. And at the end of it, people were saying, let's do more. Well, I think now is the time to do more. We've got at this stage. So, and I think St. Basil's has we are not a good example, but we have the energy and the will to continue with this. The other thing I just wanted to say before I say more thank yous was I finally see the light at the end of the tunnel for Vatican II. Really, I think back when it started, we were all excited, and where did we get in the meantime? So thank you so much.
Thank you to everybody who assisted, especially Dan and Peter, who came and added to the technological brain trust here and solved the sound problem. Just to follow up what Kathy has said, I'm the person on pastoral council who's charged with paying particular attention to synodality. So people who want to contribute, people who want to ask, whatever you want, there's at least one person who has to be 24/7 thinking about it, that's me. So I'll make sure that happens. Thank you very much, and we'll turn off the machines now.